Using clusters, paintings, and trees to find your common ancestor. Part 1. In Part 1, we'll look at the different types of clusters that are available for DNA analysis. Then we will select a cluster to analyze in more detail for a particular match that I'm hoping to find our most recent common ancestor. The most common type of autocluster involves our shared matches, or also called in common with matches. On Genetic Affairs, you can run an autocluster for your 23andMe data or your family tree DNA data. On MyHeritage, the autocluster software is found in the DNA tools, and it's based on the same software as used at Genetic Affairs. On GEDmatch, under the Tier 1 tools, you can find the same type of autocluster software as well as the AutoTree and AutoPedigree software found on Genetic Affairs. Another type of cluster is the AutoSegment cluster, and this is going to contain matches that have overlapping segments. They're going to be a mixture of maternal and paternal matches because they're looking at the segments that overlap with each other and not paying attention to shared matches at all. Again, on Genetic Affairs, you can run AutoSegment clusters for your MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, or GEDmatch data. On GEDmatch, under the Tier 1 tools, you can also run the AutoSegment cluster. Another type of cluster involving AutoSegment data is the hybrid AutoSegment clusters. On Genetic Affairs, you can combine this AutoSegment data from multiple sites. This is particularly useful if a match has tested or uploaded their data to several sites, because then you can compare the segments overlapping data from these different sites. The hybrid AutoSegment cluster is available on Genetic Affairs for MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, or GEDmatch profiles. You can use any combination of these or use all 4 of them if you wish. Perhaps my favorite cluster is the AutoSegment in common with cluster on Genetic Affairs. This uses the overlapping segments, but it also looks at the shared match groups. And so now you would have overlapping segments, but they would be all maternal or all paternal, and not a mixture as you had with just AutoSegment. You can run this for Family Tree DNA or 23andMe data on Genetic Affairs. For the parameters, typically for the Family Tree DNA or the 23andMe matches, I'll select a maximum centimorgan value that includes the closest cousin that I want to use in the analysis. And if I'm running a cluster for someone that has close family members like siblings or nieces and nephews who have tested, then I might set the max to not include these close family members. On GEDmatch, I also select the max and min for the region that I'm interested in, but their algorithm will often select which matches to put in the cluster and not necessarily include everything that I think should be there. MyHeritage sets the limits for you. They use a maximum of 400 centimorgans, and then they collect about 100 matches. So the minimum value is going to vary depending on how many matches you have, starting at 400 down till they get around 100 total. Since we're going to be looking at how this match of interest connects to my family, we need to spend a little time looking at my family. So here's a tree. It's got my parents and grandparents all deceased, and none of them took a DNA test. I'm an only child, so there's not much else I can do about it. I have one first cousin who I'm going to call Ed, only he hasn't tested. Fortunately, on my paternal side, I have two second cousins that have tested. One is on my father's paternal side, the Barry side, and the other is on my father's maternal side, the Burns side. Today we're going to look specifically at the Burns side, at matches to Thomas and Bridget's line. So Thomas and Bridget had 6 children. 2 of them died as young children. One grew to be an adult but never married. And so there were 3 sisters, and I have pictures of them shown here, pictures from about 1920, that married and had children. So here are their children. My dad and his mother, my dad, and 2 of my dad's first cousins, Mary and Elizabeth. And so their children, my cousin Trish, who's allowed me to use her real name, has done a DNA test. My cousin Stan, it's not his real name, has not. So we have 2 of the great-grandchildren from Thomas and Bridget who have tested. And hopefully I can convince Stan to test at some point in the future. It would be very nice to have one child from each of Thomas and Bridget's daughters who had children and grandchildren. So to look more at Thomas and Bridget's family, Thomas's parents were Patrick Byrne and Honora Shannon, and Thomas was born in County Roscommon. Bridget's parents are John Fenton and Joanna O'Brien, and Bridget was born in County Limerick. We also know Bridget's father's paternal grandparents, William Fenton and Bridget Lillis. Now, Thomas and Bridget met and married in Virginia. Bridget was about 13 years younger than Thomas, and so it's unlikely that they knew each other in Ireland, partly because of the age and partly because of the distance between County Roscommon and County Limerick. We're talking back in the 1860 time frame. So they met and married in Virginia. So it's a MyHeritage cluster that I want to look at in more detail and do some analysis with. And so here's the cluster. It's run from 400 centimorgans down to 25 centimorgans, which is the minimum that they picked based on, in my case, it's 94 matches. I said it was typically about 100 matches. My cousin Trish, second cousin, is in this blue cluster here that I've put a box around, and the red line underlines a bunch of gray cells that she has that match particularly the first 4 clusters here. My highest unknown match on MyHeritage is 55 centimorgans, and I've called him Joe Smith. It's not his real name. He lives in Ireland. He's in cluster number 1. Joe and I have been emailing for several years now, trying to figure out our common ancestor. His mother's maiden name was O'Brien, and she grew up in Limerick. And my second great-grandmother, Joanna O'Brien, was also from Limerick. So for several years now, we've assumed that this match to Joe and me has to be on his mother's O'Brien line. So here's cluster 1 that we're going to look at in some more detail. I've given pseudonames to all the matches, and you can see that Joe Smith is here in cluster 1. With the gray cell over here to Trish, you can see that Joe also matches Trish. So that gives us a pretty good hint that it's on the Thomas Burns and Bridget Fenton line that Trish and I share. Several of the others in cluster 1 either live in Ireland as well as Joe does, or they had ancestors that lived in Ireland. So now we're going to look at the MyHeritage profiles for the people in cluster 1 to see what information we can determine there. Anne has a small tree all the people live in the United States, and there's no indication of any ancestor going back to Ireland. So there's really not much information here that's going to be helpful. Megan is the second person in the cluster, and Barbara is the fourth. They're cousins, according to MyHeritage. They share the same private tree, but did not reply to my message. So I have no information about them at all, other than they're cousins, and they obviously are somehow connected to Joe as well as to me. Next is Joe, and he has a tree that goes back through his grandparents. This is going to be especially helpful when we start working with Joe's tree to try and extend his family back further. Emily has a twin sister, Mary. They're the next two, the fifth and sixth, and their sister to Bob, who's the eighth in this list. Sue is the mother of Frank. She doesn't have a tree, but Frank has a small tree, and he indicates that his mother's maiden name is Smith. Sarah also has a small tree and indicates that her mother's maiden name is Smith. So with the same surname Smith as Joe has, it's beginning to look like this cluster is on Joe's paternal side and not his maternal O'Brien line, as Joe and I originally had expected. Mary also replied to my message, and she told me that she was a second cousin to Joe, that her grandfather and Joe's grandmother were siblings. Well, Joe's grandmother is not going to be on his paternal Smith line, so this indicates there's likely another line that Mary, her twin sister Emily, and her brother Bob all match me on, besides Joe's paternal Smith line. I also ran the hybrid cluster because Joe was on both MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA. And so here's the hybrid segment cluster using that data. Trish is on both sites also. I've labeled on the right where the matches, which of the two sites the matches were found. And it turns out that Trish and Joe are both on MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA, and Sarah is the only other person from MyHeritage. The P that's shown by Trish and several of the other matches is paternal. I've included Trish in my tree on my family tree on Family Tree DNA, and so it's known that she's a paternal cousin to me. Therefore, any other match that she and I share is going to also be labeled paternal, which is what you're seeing here in this cluster. Having Sarah appear from MyHeritage as the only other match gives us a strong hint, because now we can see that she shares the same segment of DNA that Joe shares. So in part one, we looked at the different types of clusters. We looked at some details about my family, and we found a cluster to study in more detail that had come from MyHeritage. Have you run any auto clusters on your DNA matches and tried to find the most recent common ancestors? That's what we're going to be doing here. In part two, we're going to look at my family in some more detail. We're going to look at segment data that came from this particular cluster, as well as exploring auto kinship on genetic affairs. And then in part three, we'll try and put all these pieces together and build out a tree for Joe's family to go back further than just his grandparents. Any questions? You can contact me at patriciacolemangenealogy.com, or you can also find me in the DNA Painter user group or the Genetic Affairs user group on Facebook. I'm a moderator for each of these groups.